Hello my friends, hope you are well. In my last video I'd knocked up some cool little trench bases and I had so much fun making these that I wanted to turn them into a slightly larger scene. So that's what we're doing today, let's get straight into it.
Swamp Rip Miniatures.
When I was picturing this happy little trench scene in my head, I had a recurring image of some grizzled, jaded looking Cadian soldier sitting down huffing away on a cigarette. And unsurprisingly, no such miniature exists, so I'm having to cobble him together using a bunch of old and new Cadian pieces from my bits box. These mismatched pieces do mean I have to use some green stuff to fill in any gaps, which does look a bit messy at the moment, but we'll clean that up later. This sling arm from the Cadian Command Squad box felt like a great addition to make him look a bit battered up, and I followed it with one of the older Cadian heads because I love how chonky they are. I couldn't find an arm with a cigarette on it though, which meant I had to make my own by drilling through this hand and sticking a little piece of wire into the hole. I'd planned to have him holding the cigarette up to his mouth, but I realised the hand I'd used would have obscured too much of his face, so he can hold it slightly downward instead. I used another blob of green stuff to bulk out the shoulder pad a bit so it'd be a bit closer in size to the other one, and once it had all had time to cure fully, I came in and tidied it all up using a hobby knife, some files and some sandpaper, leaving us with this unhappy little chappie. This guy was definitely looking pretty close to what I'd imagined in my head, but I felt like a couple more soldiers would make the trench feel a lot more lived in. This meant more cobbleization of random Cadian pieces and green stuff, which wasn't a bad thing because for the second guy I dug out some really cool arms like this resting lasgun one and this one holding a helmet, which combined well with a battle scarred head to create another grizzled looking veteran in a cool pose. I really love these little alternative Cadian parts as they're great for dioramas and scenes like this where you want a bit more character in your miniatures as opposed to just generic aiming down weapon pose. And that's part of the reason I'm not so keen on the newer shock trooper kits, as the individual parts are designed to be built into one specific pose, meaning you have to do a ton more kit bashing work if you want them to look even slightly different. But I'll still use them though, as they do have their own merits, like having a higher level of detail than the old versions. And for my final miniature I was able to use one of these newer sculpts to build a guy looking out over the parapet with some binoculars, although even he needed some green stuff around his shoulders so they'd sit a bit more naturally. Now, these are the 3 finished miniatures I'll be using for the build today, and I was feeling really excited to start the scene as I felt like these guys all had quite interesting poses that could tell a story, so it's time to build up a little section of trench for them. To get the basic shape popping, I'm using a bunch of XPS foam, and most of these pieces are random little offcuts I've saved from previous builds, but it doesn't matter if they look rougher than your mum on a Monday morning, as they're not going to be visible in the end anyway. For some reason though, once I had the basic shape done, I spent some time adding these tiny little snippets of foam all around the outside to kind of make it a bit more even. This was basically pointless, but once I'd finished faffing around, we were left with this random mess of foam, which was ready for a bit of structural work. The idea here is exactly the same as it was in the trench basing video I showed last time, building up some nice retaining walls to keep the mud from collapsing back into the trench using an assortment of materials that will look like wood or metal at this scale. I've used some sandwich bag tie things to create some makeshift panels of corrugated metal sheeting first, then I cover the bulk of the remaining foam with some different wooden items. There's a ton of different things you can use for this, but I'm mostly using coffee stirrers and matchsticks today, and for the coffee stirrers I like to split them into more narrow planks, as having a variety of different sized pieces helps to make the trench look a bit more thrown together and natural, and the thinner planks just generally work a bit better at the scale too. I'm being fairly random with my placement of all these little planks, trying to mix up the different sizes and orientation of them to get some nice variation with the textures, but one thing I am doing quite routinely is framing each of the sections using the matchsticks and skewers and whatever else I have that's thicker than the planks, just so they stick out a bit more. This adds a really cool kind of reinforced look to the walls, and in my opinion looks way better than just adding all the planks on their own. I wanted to build a little doorway that would lead into a dugout for our soldiers to take shelter in, so I used some thicker wooden skewers to create more of a sturdy looking frame, followed by a few extra pieces of coffee stirrer planks to bulk it out a bit. I thought a tarp would look pretty cool here as a makeshift door, so I glued on a couple of pieces of kitchen roll or kitchen towel for Americans, then soaked them with some watered down PVA glue to harden it up a bit with a kind of paper mache effect, making sure to leave a bunch of creases in there for a bit of visual interest. This was my first time doing paper mache since I was a young field mouse at school, eating all my pencils and pooing in all my pants, but it worked really well for this tarp and I will definitely be using it again for the future. The last of the wooden Mohicans was a little bench for the smoking Cadian to sit on, and this was super simple really, just a couple of skewers for supports and a coffee stirrer plank for the seat. So now that all my building work was finished, it was time to cover our little trench scene with sweet mud, but I first added a couple of holes for puddles later on and also stuck in some broken pipes down here, which I thought could be a cool little detail later. This mud mixture was looking especially tasty today, like a nice chocolate fudge cake mixture, and it only took me like 3 mouthfuls to remember it's actually made of sand filler and glue, meaning I did have enough left over to cover up that exposed foam luckily. And while it was still wet, I stuck in a bunch of coffee stirrer planks on the floor to act as duck boards, using my pliers to rough them up a bit and make them look a bit more worn out beforehand. I used a bit more mud in the corners and around some of the edges of the wooden sections to look like it's all muddy and caving in a bit, you know, we don't want it looking too immaculate in here. Then also sprinkled on a tiny bit of sandy, gravelly basin mixture for added texture and glued down a couple of random chains. Looking pretty good so far, but no self-respecting trench would ever be caught out in the wild without some sandbags. I remember seeing a video a while ago where they'd made some really easy sandbags, and I think it was from the Cult of Crafting. I'll chuck it up on screen here if it was, but I wanted to try it out since then, and it's genuinely super simple and easy. I'm just rolling and flattening out a sausage of milliput, then cutting out small sections which I shape with my fingers and score with a hobby knife to add a small seam on the sides. So shout out to them for the great idea. I'll definitely be borrowing it for my own builds in the future, and for this one I'm just laying these down on top of each other while they're still soft, as it allows me to kind of squish them down to look more natural and weighty. And I'm not being especially neat or systematic with them really, just layering them up over the dugout to give it a bit of extra protection, and then using them to cover up any exposed areas also. Once they're all on, I used a bit more mud to fill in any gaps and help them blend in a bit better, and then the very final touches I'm giving to this build for now are a few little greebly pieces from leftover Cadian sprues, which I'm actually starting to run quite low on now, which is kind of sad because they are my favourite greebles to add to builds like this, but also a positive thing because it now means I can buy a ton more kits to collect up all those little spares and extra details again. So here is the finished build. Obviously it's looking a bit rough around the edges with all the exposed wood and different weird colours and textures going on, but once it's painted we should be able to see the wood for the trees. I don't know if I'm using that right, I never really understood what it means. Anyway, painting time. I think we'll whiz through this stage quite quickly because I have shown the painting process for most of this stuff previously and there's nothing super fancy going on here really. So for the wood, I start by building up a kind of varied base coat by half stippling and half dry brushing on a few different browns just to get a bit of texture going. I then use a couple of darker and lighter browns to build up scratchy wood grain texture with some little circular bits to look like knots. Then apply some snakebite leather contrast paint to blend it all together and add a bit more richness. I give it a quick dusty dry brushing to help it look a bit more aged, and then slosh on a few different dark washes to add some definition between the planks on the floors and panelled wall sections, and also give the impression they've become saturated with damp and moisture. The metal areas were next, and they were even easier than the wood. I just do a quick bit of a dark metallic colour first, followed by a dark brown wash and a rust effect paint to make it look more fitting of the trench environment. This time I did also play around with adding some more little scratchy bits of a brighter metallic colour onto the rusty bits, and this was a nice little addition for a more varied look, so definitely worth experimenting with. After that, I turned my attention to the mud, and a lot of this had already got some residual washes splashed over from the wood and the metal areas, so I just went around adding a bit more definition using some muddy brown and green colours. Then for any areas that were not looking grungy enough, I just played Pearl Jam on repeat for like 6 hours, then chucked on a few more washes as well. At this point, the only unpainted areas were all the little greebly bits and the sandbags we added, and I was feeling quite lazy by now actually, so after giving them a quick base coat and a rough highlight, I drenched them all in some streaking grime to build up a really dirty trench life layer. I then wicked away some of the excess using a bit of white spirit, but leaving a lot of that dirt in the crevices and harder to reach areas. This looked pretty good. It's definitely the level of griminess we'd expect to see in a trench or between my toes, but adding a few little touch-ups of the original highlight colours helped these areas to pop even more. And I'm liking how this baby's looking now. It's definitely got some good trenchy colours going on, so to finish it off completely, I brush on some gloss varnish in areas I think moisture would gather, giving the surface a nice shiny wet finish, but being careful not to go too over the top of this, as I don't want every surface to be all shiny and wet. I then applied a whopping total of 4 whole grass tufts, opting for this nice beige dead grass colour to fit the aesthetic, and added a few drops of water effect into those puddles around the pipes, up top and in between some of the duckboards, using a toothpick to poke it in there. I repainted the rim of my makeshift base black to freshen it up a bit, and then it was time for those pesky little Cadians. And what can I say about these guys that I haven't already said before? You know, I've painted a bunch of Cadians in previous videos using that kind of classic tan and green paint scheme, just because for me it's really iconic and they're one of my favourite things to paint. I do think to myself though, am I going to bore people by painting tan and green Cadians periodically throughout my videos? And maybe I should stop painting them and move on to some different miniatures for these kind of builds, or just mix up the paint scheme at least. But then that tiny little voice in the back of my head says,
I'm not gonna fucking stop.
So I can almost guarantee you'll see these guys again in the future. Much like the greebles in the trench itself, I wanted these guys to be pretty dirty and grimy, looking like they've actually been living in muddy trenches for a prolonged period. So the streaking grime was out again on top of a rough and ready paint job, which gave me a really nice effect that I pushed a bit further, using some more delicately placed highlights on top for added pizzazz. Wow. I finished the last areas of painting by touching up the skin a bit, oi oi, painting in the little insignias using a faded grey colour, and painting the lenses on these binoculars, which may have been my favourite part of the whole paint job, as they just contrasted really nicely with the dirty clothing and armour. I did their little eyeballs too, and gave this guy's scar a bit of extra flavour to help them stand out. I felt like this paint job could benefit from a bit more dirt and mud around the boots to really suggest they've been living that trench warfare lifestyle. So I gave them a nice heavy coating of this muddy brown pigment stuff, and this actually gave a really nice effect in combination with the other dirty areas. Then for the very final touch on this entire build, I added a little wispy bit of cotton wool onto the end of my boy's cigarette to act as smoke, and I'd seen this on Instagram a while ago but couldn't for the life of me find the photo again, so apologies to whoever I've stolen this idea from, and thank you for the inspiration. I then added the miniatures to the diorama, and it was time to see how it all came together. So my friends, what do you think? Another really fun one to build and paint, and I was feeling really excited about making this after the recent trench base I did in my previous video, as it's surprisingly easy to whip up trench stuff like this using materials that cost next to nothing. I'm quite happy with how the miniatures turned out as well. I don't really paint stuff to look this dirty often, so it was really fun to not have to fixate on getting little edge highlights and whatever else to be as precise as possible. It was basically just a case of getting everything super grimy, adding a few little highlights in there to add some definition back, and then add in even more dirt. So yeah, I really enjoyed making this scene, and I hope it provides a cool little snapshot into the life of some unfortunate trench-dwelling Cadians. If you enjoyed watching this, then please like the video or subscribe to my channel and leave a comment down below to let me know which part of the build you like most, or whether you'd rather fight a shark in 4 feet of water or a tiger in 5 feet of jam. Follow me on Instagram at SwampRatMiniatures to see some of my works in progress, or to slide into my DMs and talk about tiny green men. For now though, I have been your friendly neighborhood Swamp Rat, and I will see you very soon in another video. See ya.